So we're here to talk about serious business. You all serve on the Aspen Institute's Commission on Information Disorder, and we're now going to talk through some impossible philosophical problems and the various unsatisfying answers that we have for them, but somehow hopefully we'll muddle through and create a better internet. So we hear a lot about misinformation, disinformation. You all are focused on something called information disorder. So what is that?
So broadly speaking, when we think about disinformation, we think about social media and really more the tactical edge of a disinformation problem. But the issue here is much more structural and much more systemic. There's been an erosion, for instance, of traditional media. You have this expansion of social media, particularly during COVID, and just the velocity of information. And then you have political propaganda. So it's a much broader information ecosystem. And something has gone wrong along the way to get us where we are now. And typically, we're not talking about something that's brand new here. The joke I've made in the past is that disinformation or propaganda is the world's third oldest profession, second being intelligence operations. We all know what the first one is. So this has been around. It has just changed so dramatically, in part because of technology over the last several years. And this is what we're trying to get to the bottom of within the commission.
Right, so you're sort of trying to create a healthier information environment, which I support, but I do feel like I should challenge the definition at least a little bit, right? So, some people might say that we face not so much a disorder, but a new order where there are fewer gatekeepers, and the absence of gatekeepers has allowed a bunch of voices to be included in conversations where historically they may not have been welcome. So what is the case that this world that we're living in is fundamentally broken or diseased?
Well, I mean, I don't think that there was a good old days.
Yeah.
There's always been challenges in terms of information. And I think right now we're focusing on the incentive structures that allow for certain information to be amplified, that prioritizes certain behavior, that prioritizes certain attacks. And so it's not just the sort of disorder of the sort of ecosystem, but it's also sort of all of the ways in which those harms are not shared equally as well. And so I think if we sort of think about what we have to do to move forward, I think we'll get to a place where we both recognize that there was no good old days and that the sort of solutions are not solutions that actually come from the past, but actually are really focused on the future.
Right, so this is obviously a huge subject, right? And it spans like every corner of government and media and commerce. You all got together earlier this year to try to wrap your arms around it. So what have you been doing, and how have you been trying to narrow this down into something where you can maybe introduce some solutions? Kathryn?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we should make sure we get across is that we've come at this with a lot of humility. This is a very big topic. There are a lot of experts, and we had a lot of experts both on the commission and that we listened to. So we had digested over 500 reports and papers, and we have experts that came and gave testimony, and all of this is available on the website, by the way, for anyone to look at. It's a tremendous amount of information that we took in, and we don't pretend to have all of the answers. This is very complex, and I've been saying, actually, to anyone who's asking me about how this is going, I work on climate change, I work on democracy reform, and in all of those things, if you had a magic wand and you handed it to me, I could tell you what I wanted to do with it in climate or in democracy. On disinformation, it's more like a really tricky genie that's going to give you 3 wishes that you're going to mess up on. You have to think about the phrasing of every single word, right? Because there are unintended consequences and just so much complexity in this. So I think that's the most important thing to really get across.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. So I write a lot about these issues. One thing I have observed over the past couple of years is that we see more and more authoritarian governments passing laws against misinformation or disinformation as a pretext for then cracking down on legitimate speech, on dissent, on journalism, right? And to me, that feels like one of those genies. So as you started to kind of work towards solutions, how did you think about practically balancing those or offering recommendations to the institutions who are ultimately going to be responsible for doing it?
So in general, we're not talking about the government's going to step in with a series of interventions and it's going to fix everything. This is ultimately has to be a whole of society approach, which is really probably the hardest part of all this. Is you have to kind of want to heal thyself for this to be successful. So the platforms are going to have a series of actions they're going to need to take. Media in general, civil society. When you just think about through the K through 12 educational system, I've got 5 kids that are in school, and you look at the opportunities available to them on digital literacy, on civics in general, that's all dropped off the kind of the ledger from an educational perspective. So there are going to be, again, a series of actions for a range of different players, and ultimately not putting the government in a position where they're the arbiter of truth. To your point, I mean, look what Putin did with Navalny's apps with Apple and Google over the past week or so.
I mean, and there is the really incredible importance of the government not being the arbiter of truth. As someone who leads a civil rights organization and is working to constantly push for the type of social change that opens our democracy up to more people. And at the same time, that work over the last decades, long before I was ever here on this earth, many of those rules and laws that have been fought for and died for are under contention in Silicon Valley, where you have big platform leaders, billionaires, pretending like they don't actually have to adhere to civil rights. And to the extent that the only sort of force that can actually compel them is the government, that is the rule of law. And holding the sort of principles of First Amendment and of our ability to speak freely, but recognizing that all of this relates to power. Who has it and who doesn't, and recognizing that the role that the outsized influence of these platforms in being able to create a hostile climate for certain communities and being able to prevent people from being able to have their voices heard, the ways in which disinformation or a big lie actually then creates real harm in real people's lives. How do we ensure that folks are still able to fight for a better future while recognizing that a better future is actually still possible?
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, you mentioned that this is a whole of society problem. I find, when I'm writing my column, I'll often find myself wanting to write something like, well, we need a systemic approach. And I always feel like if you're the person in the audience right now, that's where I lose you, right? Because you're like, it just sounds like it's somebody else's problem, right? Oh, okay, we'll just leave it to the whole of society to fix things. So next month, you guys are going to be releasing some recommendations. Can you get practical with me at all? What the heck are we going to do about any of these very real harms you've just identified?
So first, I want to kind of gently correct a pronoun you use.
Yeah.
It's someone else's problem. It's everyone's problem.
Yeah.
And if it's everyone's problems, everyone has a stake in the solution space. And that's why when you look at the group, you look at the commission, the 16 members, they're drawn from a very broad set of disciplines. So government, media, Katie Couric's the other co-chair with us, and again, it speaks to the need for a broader set of solutions. Again, to Kathryn's humility point of disinformation experts from a research perspective have been looking at this problem for years and years and years, and they're just kind of like, we don't know what the answers are. And we're not saying that we're going to fix this thing. We're trying to, at a minimum, round the edges off and make it more of a safer environment for everyone to operate within. So again, to some of the practical solutions, when you think about, I'll go to the social media space, I'll just start there. There are a set of transparency requirements, I think, that we have to introduce into the space. And it's not just for existing platforms, but for platforms going forward. You look at the proliferation of, particularly on the far right, some of the platforms that have popped up over the last years, and they immediately, within a set of days, if not weeks, had some trust and safety issues. They just, the thought that went into setting up the platforms that exposed, they had all sorts of data leakages and personal identifiable information.
Right.
So to the extent that we can set out a series of best practices and recommendations on transparency and trust and safety, that is going to make the entire ecosystem better.
Right. I mean, let me challenge you on that point, right? Okay, let's say Parler or Gab, comes out after month one and they say, well, we accidentally hosted 1,000 images of terrorism, right? How have we fixed anything?
Separate issue
Yep.
on extremist online behavior as opposed to disinformation. But again, the idea here is that Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, whatever, Instagram, those aren't the last social media platforms that we'll ever experience. There will be others that follow on. And we don't do a good enough job, I think, across society or technology in general, of extracting the kind of the meta points, the meta best practices and lessons learned, and then distilling them down, and to Rashad's point, pushing the solutions forward.
Right. Give me some other ideas for things that you hope comes out of this work, or practical things that you hope someone does.
Well, we put it into 3 buckets, really. It's around transparency, which is what Chris has mentioned, and then harms, and trust. And I think all 3 of those things are incredibly important. The lack of trust is actually one of the biggest issues that we have here, and probably the hardest one to deal with, because information, one person's propaganda is another person's truth, and that depends on who you trust to give you that information. So really, again, there's bringing that to civil society. It's also asking, why do we have this problem, and specifically, why do we have it so badly here in the United States? We really did also look at what's outside, where are people elsewhere finding answers for some of this, right. And there is a real difference in the way that we deal with that. So
I think that there's some sort of big questions, right? Transparency on these platforms, and sort of being compelled, both in terms of sort of how they're dealing with researchers and some of the questions we've already seen in terms of the platforms being able to block researchers and really being able to compel them around that. How our data is protected and how that's dealt with. Questions that are not things that we can mandate by law, but are things that we need to elevate more attention around. If Russia knows more about black people than Facebook does, and we head into an election where Facebook is playing a huge role, then that's a problem for all of us in our democracy. And we actually have to have real calls on these platforms around how they are addressing and dealing with questions of diversity. We wrestled as a commission with many different perspectives about how to think about sort of reform and engagement around Section 230, and sort of all the ways in which Section 230 allows for voices to be heard, allows for deep discussions to happen on these platforms, and at the same time, no one in our democracy, in our society, should be completely immune from the type of harm that is created. We sort of dealt in deep, and I think we wrestled, and I think that's the important, as someone who puts out my own platforms about what needs to be done with the platforms, or how do we deal with disinformation and the impacts on civil rights, as someone who's had to go back and forth with the platforms, and Color of Change won those campaigns to get, for instance, Facebook to do a civil rights audit. The goal of being part of a commission like this is that we need more people to care about this issue. We need more people focused on it, and we need a wider range of people to see this as their issue. And so part of I think the beauty of those discussions and those debates is what folks will see when the report comes out is a lot of work to come to consensus among folks that view solving problems in different ways, and we came to a set of agreements around a path forward that by no means is perfect, as Kathryn said, but I do think creates a real opportunity not just for more discussion, but hopefully for more action.
Right. I'm really interested to learn about how you approach the government questions. You've spoken a lot already about sort of solving problems at the platform level, and they have a lot of problems to solve. That's sort of most of what I write about is sort of what I think the platforms ought to be doing here. Can we talk a little bit about the government? Section 230, if you're not familiar, this sort of famously controversial law that in most cases gives the big platforms immunity from prosecution if I defame someone else on the network. Did you guys land on a position on 230? And if you don't want to talk about that, like what are some things what are some areas where you think that governments can intervene in a way that doesn't just destroy free speech on the internet?
Yeah.
No, you got it. Go ahead.
No, you go.
Well, look, 230 is not something that we're going to be able to talk about in a nuanced, meaningful way in the remaining 11 minutes here before Q&A. But to step back more broadly on government, look, having been in the middle of this, if not at the forefront of government action on countering disinformation for the last 4 or 5 years, One of the key priorities that I had coming out of the last administration, I really had two that I wanted my successor and the Biden administration to focus on. First was ransomware, and we saw where that got us. And then the second piece was actually having a coherent strategic approach to disinformation, because right now it is treated as duties as otherwise assigned. When you think about the national security community, it is just one of many, many different things. And in fact, what my view is that we need someone that actually owns the space, that has in a senior leadership position, is thinking strategically about principally countering foreign disinformation. That's really the space that I had been working at. But ultimately, we need someone in charge. We need a coherent strategy for understanding and countering disinformation. We need an agency or an organization within government. We're not saying which one. We're not saying it's the Federal Trade Commission or the Federal Communications Commission that needs to be in charge, but someone has to be at the forefront. And kind of wrap it up here, but what I like in the moment we are in right now, it's almost like a post-Enron moment, where we've had a failure of transparency across platforms, and we need a Sarbanes-Oxley-like solution for platforms to increase transparency on how the algorithms work, how ads are being bought and paid for, what sort of additional sponsorship are we seeing across the users of the platforms. There are a series of things that have to be done. And so ultimately, yes, government is going to have to step in, but from a regulatory perspective, I see it more as not an arbiter of truth, but an enforcer of a series of actions that the platforms have demonstrated they are not able to self-police on. And so how can government say you have to be more transparent across these actions?
Right. Okay. Well, so let's talk about a fundamental partisan divide that is at the heart of a lot of these issues. In the broadest terms, liberals generally think that platforms should take more things down, and conservatives think that platforms should leave almost everything up. My first question is, was that latter viewpoint represented on your panel as you had these discussions?
Look, we have a very diverse ideological and political team on the platform. I mean, I served in the Trump administration. Come on.
Yeah.
So we had a good spray. We had a Republican Congressman, Will Hurd, and so we are very, First Amendment we're not taking the approach that there needs to be some tweak to the First Amendment. That is not the angle here. That is actually the context in which we look at everything, and it's freedom of speech and the freedom to listen and to hear. So government not playing a role here. Platforms have a responsibility for maintaining their operations, and to the extent that there is harmful behavior, there have to be a series of mitigation steps to follow.
Right. Well,
and I don't think that the right wants everything on the platforms to stay up. I think they just want their stuff to stay up on the platforms.
It is often an argument of convenience, to be sure, but there's clearly a divide there. Can that be reconciled in a way that is nonpartisan, less partisan? I mean, you propose transparency as one solution, which I sort of think is good. But ultimately, somebody's going to have to make these calls, right?
I mean, I think that's part of our hope here, is that we show a way of moving forward in a bipartisan way to say, here, there are pathways. It may not be, one big answer, right? There may be lots of little answers, and they may, but those things can add up to progress around that. And if we can show that, yes, we agree, these are things that actually shouldn't be partisan. They are, but they shouldn't be.
Yes.
And so we need to get to a space where we can start talking with each other around this. And frankly, the platforms are benefiting from the fact that there's no agreement there, because it just keeps going and going and going. I mean, Facebook begs to be regulated, but also they know that that's not going to happen. So that's, and so really, I mean, I would actually say that Facebook's begging to be regulated, but what they really need is to be disrupted. I mean, there is a real opportunity here, again, as a whole of society coming together here to say, what about if you're an investor, if you're a philanthropist, we actually know how to build more pro-social networks. Why don't we come together and do that? And I think that's a particularly good topic for this room.
Yes, good dinner conversation.
One of the challenges of, I think, the last several decades, and especially the last decade with the rise of the platforms and as more of our speech and more of our engagement has gone to those platforms, is that there has been this trap that I think we've fallen into where people's ability to express who they are has become political speech. And the platforms sort of benefit from this because they will sort of run nice ads on Black History Month or Gay Pride Month or Women's History Month, and then they will make an ad for Pride a political ad and political speech as if like just simply celebrating who you are is political. And what that does is it changes the nature of what people are willing to fight for. There is right and left, and that's the political debate, and then there's right and wrong. And at some point in our society, we have to have the moral authority to be able to just say what's right and wrong and to be able to fight for that. And not at every single turn be afraid that someone's gonna cast something that is absolutely about someone's ability to live in our society and have opportunity and to be able to be heard and free from the threat of violence, that is somehow political. And we have to be willing to fight for that. And those in the tech world that actually wanna be on the right side of history, that wanna look back 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now and actually believe that they did something that moved us forward, need to join us in that effort. Because otherwise, we're playing this game that is completely dangerous for a country that is becoming more and more multiracial, and democracy is not guaranteed. If we want to protect a multiracial democracy, we have to actually hold some things sacred. And some of those things is our identities are not political. Our identities are worth fighting for. And we have to have more people who may not actually look like or come from those communities willing to stand up for it.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the future of our wayward democracy here. When I think of sort of problems in the information world that worry me the most, one of them is that the majority of Republicans will now tell pollsters, at least, that they think the last election was stolen. And we see all kinds of activity all around the country right now, designed to enable similar efforts to steal the election on Republicans' behalf, probably in 2024. So one thing you could say is, well, this is a big lie, and this is misinformation, this is disinformation, right? Another thing you can say is that Republicans have just sort of given up on democracy and decided that they want to go get power by any means necessary. I'm sure this is something that you thought about as you were putting your report together. Is the big lie an information disorder problem, or is it something else?
Yes.
Great.
I mean, it's
so,
both, right? I mean, look, this is actually the thing, particularly from protected political speech. When you think about elected members, in part they can hide behind the truth, the debate clause, speech and debate clause in the Constitution. This is probably one of the thorniest problems that I don't think we have a good solution on. How do you keep those that continue to push a false narrative around the 2020 election, which just becomes a circular conversation? They say, look, our constituents, what they care about is election integrity. They don't believe in the election. Well, it's because you've been talking about this for the past year, about how it was stolen. So it's a self-licking ice cream cone. And in that piece, there have to...
Wait, is that a phrase that's never been said before?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Maybe not on this stage.
Yeah.
But look, there are certain communities within society that I think we have levers that we can pull. So, for instance, doctors and professional boards, whether it's the medical or legal profession, there are professional licensing boards. But with the elected officials community, either at the federal level or state or local, really your opportunity is at the ballot box. And unfortunately, that is going to be far too long, whether it's 22 or 24, if we continue on this path. We are seeing an erosion of confidence in democracy, in the processes by which we elect our leaders, that in my view, we're really on the brink of something. And I'm not sure if everyone read it. We were talking about it beforehand, but there was a essay in the Washington Post over the weekend by Robert Kagan, I think, that it's a 25-minute read treatise, but it is horrifying. And at the same time, I'm like,
worthwhile.
Yep, that's exactly what's happening right now. And so is this information disorder? Absolutely, because they're using the tools that Rashad pointed out of power structures. Disinformation is a tool of those that have sought dominion over others for the history of humanity. But we are also in a singularly potentially catastrophic moment right now in terms of American democracy and how that's being abused. And we've seen a part of a party completely move away from the last 250 years of how we've elected officials.
I agree. That piece is amazing, by the way. Everyone should read that. It's quite chilling. And when I think about that problem, I don't know how you solve that at the government level, at the platform level, at the media level, right? When I sort of kicked this off by saying we're going to talk about some impossible philosophical problems, that's kind of what I'm talking about. But I do want everyone here thinking about it, because I can't imagine a more important problem, right, that we're all going to have to think about in the coming weeks, months, and years. We're starting to run short on time. I had a few questions I wanted to ask you as individuals. Kathryn, you famously married into a family that is often associated with misinformation and disinformation. How has that informed your work on this project? Hard questions only today.
Well, I think that what I always answer to something about my family is this: I'm my own person. I'm responsible for what I do. So I'm happy to talk about the work that I do at the foundation. I'm happy to talk about the investments that I make. I'm happy to do anything that I'm actually responsible for. But I don't have. I have never had a job in the company. I've not been a party to any of that, and so it has informed the way I think about things, and I hope that I was able to bring some perspective, some outside perspective onto some of the topics that we were discussing, but probably more to do with the way that media businesses function, and the way that I think actually I think there's a lot of similarities between the way that Facebook is reacting to things the way that Fox does, in the sense that if you're driven purely by engagement or ratings, which are the same thing, right? Engagement and ratings are the same thing. Those metrics don't make for a better society, right? And so you really have to have a set of guiding principles from the beginning, and that's why I said I think it needs to be disrupted, because those have to start. You have to start with those things. Not try to tack them on later from public pressure.
Oh, very interesting. Rashad, I want to talk to you about your work in your capacity as a civil rights leader. We sometimes talk about these issues at a very abstract level, right? It's like, oh, the misinformation, bad, right? You spend a lot of time studying the practical impact of some of these civil rights issues on real communities. Can you talk a little bit about what problems information disorder is creating in real people's lives?
Well, you only have to look at the sort of laws that are popping up around the country around voting, taking away people's ability to vote based off of or rooted in a lie that has been proliferated on the platforms. You look at sort of COVID misinformation and disinformation. We live in a country where we will change a whole set of policing laws around sort of an uptick in gun violence, but not deal with 500,000 deaths because of OxyContin or 600,000 deaths because of COVID misinformation and disinformation. And it's because of sort of all the racialized ways of how we've looked at who is to blame in society and who is to not, and all the ways that information travels that. But one thing I fundamentally know, and why I'm part of this commission, is that we will always lose in the back rooms. Anything dealing with racial justice or civil rights will always lose in the back rooms if we don't have people lined up at the front door. And part of this work will require not just black folks and people of color, but white folks and people who do not see themselves impacting, recognizing that there is a higher call. If you actually believe in democracy and not something else, if you believe in democracy, then maybe you might have to lose a little bit of the other things that you want to win in service of actually making sure that we keep democracy surviving. And that is actually one of the things I've appreciated about Chris's involvement in this, is that I know that there are probably some things that we are working on that might make him lose some things that he might actually care about, and Kathryn as well. But at the end of the day, if we are actually to make sure that we can all be heard, counted, and visible, regardless of whether we are privileged or vulnerable, in the majority or the minority, or in favor or out of favor with whoever may be in power, that is under contention right now. And we need people who are true patriots to actually work to protect it.
Absolutely. I think I'm going to ask one more question. If you have questions for the panel, this would be a good time to start lining up. But Chris, I want to ask you just sort of real quick, can you talk about disinformation as an actual national security threat? Like, how does it make America weaker maybe than people might think?
Yeah, so I spent the last 4 or 5 years kind of at the tactical edge of countering disinformation, famously coming out of the 2016 election, Russian attempts to interfere and influence. We saw Iran try to get in the middle of the 2020 election, whereas the Russians and the Chinese actually kind of took the back seat. But what is happening is we are seeing tactically, whether it's those 3 countries and frankly everybody else is trying to get into the mix, including some of those domestic actors as well, including domestic extremists. They understand that by attacking our institutions, our public institutions, our democratic institutions, eroding confidence in the average American's understanding of how the processes work and having confidence and faith in them, that contributes to a downfall. You know, the Kremlin wants this sort of instability, as does the Chinese Communist Party, because it actually furthers their own objectives too. But the biggest mistake that we make is we treat disinformation as a national security threat. It is, among other things, because if we only treat it as a national security threat, we miss the bigger picture, and we can't attack the economic and the business incentives that Kathryn and Rashad have talked about.
Well said. I think we have a question here, and if you would just let us know your name and who you're representing here today.
Alex Krugloff, I'm an entrepreneur. One topic that I feel we haven't talked about much is the profit motive. It feels to me that on the talking head side, what generally tends to work and provoke is things that are loud and outrageous, tends to be misinformation-y in nature. And on the other hand, we have platforms where their goal is to amplify. And when you have amplification platforms with 1 billion+ users, they tend to amplify things that provoke, because that tends to drive engagement. And so when we can think about lots and lots of sticks, but at the end of the day, unless we can work closely with the entities that have a profit motive, unless they're somehow dissuaded, this feels like it will continue indefinitely. So I'm very curious how you guys think about it.
I completely agree. One of the things that, you know, as I mentioned, being at the tactical edge where you're knocking this stuff down, what I wanted to do with some of my time after the administration was get to kind of the root causes of disinformation right now. And Rashad talked about it. This is power structures. It's power, it's influence, and it's money. You look at what's happening right now with some of the election, the 2020, this is about power, getting back in power, but it's also about fundraising. You look at the fundraising that happened in Arizona with the so-called audit down there. You look at what the former president has raised in terms of his war chest going forward. This is about power structures and money. So to the extent that we can continue to expose those things, and one of them on the platform side is increasing transparency in the business models, in the ads that are posted, very plainly saying this is an advertisement. It's not always clear, but also kind of skating to where the puck is going. And there was an interesting operation this summer, or earlier in the spring, where a Russian ad agency was approaching Instagram and TikTok users across, you know, Europe and India, and saying, hey, $2,000 if you can post this information about the Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines, but you can't say that you're being promoted or paid to do it. Right. That is the future. It's sponsorship of content that we have to put more clarity around how those things are happening.
Great, thank you. Do we have another one right here? Yeah.
Hi, Dakota Gruner with ID 2020. I was intrigued by the transparency requirements proposal, but as the executive director of a nonprofit working on the ethics for digital ID, and actually a nonprofit organization that found ourselves at the center of vaccine misinformation at the height of the pandemic, I've become pretty cynical about the potential for sort of well-articulated best practices to actually drive change in practice. And so I was curious sort of who you see enforcing or holding accountable the organizations as these transparency requirements are put forward? Thank you.
Great question.
So we don't specify within any of the recommendations right now, I don't think, at least in the latest version, of what specific agencies have the lead there. But it could be something like the Federal Trade Commission, or, depending on what the Congress, good luck, or the administration doing of setting up something along the lines of the Consumer Protection Bureau, some sort of organization or entity like that. But they would need resources, they would need capabilities and sophistication to be able to do it, and none of that exists or is resident within government right now.
One quick follow-up. What role do you see, if anything, for sort of market-led, whether it's certification, some form of, sort of industry approach?
I think through some of my hope is through some of the recommendations on transparency and actually security researchers and others being able to dig into the algorithms that'll kind of shine a light on some of the internal business practices that the market can then can act on.
All right, unfortunately that's all the time we have. Thanks very much, and hopefully these folks will stick around. You can buttonhole them. We have one more? We have 5 more?
Just one more?
One more? All right, we'll go with one more. Quick.
Quick.
2 sentences.
Sure, Stephanie Rule with NBC News. With all due respect, a lot of what we're talking about here is important, and the moral compass and the ethical standards and the mission of organizations. But what we're talking about, is this all at the fringe when every night in America, millions of people are fed knowing absolute lies? The vaccine, for example, millions of people. So all that we're talking about really feels very fringy when the center organ of the body is rotting every day.
I think this goes to what I was saying before. I think we have to ask ourselves why there's such an appetite for that here. Because there has to be a market for disinformation. There has to be a market.
I think that markets are created, and I think that the incentive structures. I don't disagree with you, Stephanie, on what we're getting from
If you
what we
people
get
Diet
every
Coke
night.
and fried chicken every night, it's more delicious than vegetables.
Yeah, no, and as someone who battles against food deserts, I absolutely know that you can't ask people to be resilient in the face of sort of capitalism and corporate power. You simply can't. And so, I do think that these are big questions, and I think that the levers, whether they be at the FCC or the FTC, are deeply challenging. And what people are being fed every night on Fox News and Newsmax and some of these places, is putting real people and real communities in harm's way. I think a lot of what we were able to come through this commission is not the full scope of what people will be addressed or what needs to be addressed. I think it is a set of proposals that speaks to the incentive structures, but by no means should be seen as the sort of full set of demands that will sort of deal with the disorders and the incentive structures and the profit motives behind all the ways in which our communities are being harmed. And I think that is why we need more folks in this room to stand up and speak out and use the power that they actually have in the places that they are to not only shine a light, but to actually put real action behind it.
All right, the recommendations come out October 11th. Thank you very much.